Hello, everyone. We're talking about chapter 15 today. Welcome back. Appreciate all of your responses. I've been getting caught up on grading the online responses. I graded test one. You did well, and some things I think in general probably would be helpful to take thorough notes. I think the people that took better notes probably did better on the test because remember, you can use those notes for the test itself. It's open notes. So American art pre-World War II, here are the questions for today. The first question, what three factors lead to American modernism being distinct from European modernism between the wars? We'll talk about that. And some other factors about how American art kind of operates different than some of the work that we've talked about thus far. And it's interesting because I think some of the connections are American goes to Europe, and that's some of the modernism as well. It's interesting too, this chapter is a little bit longer, and there are quite a few artists that all merit a much longer robust discussion. So I hope your interest is piqued today by these just brief, very brief introductions into each of these artists. So I'm really going to zoom on these because there are quite a few to cover. A really interesting case study of an American artist and a good example of American modernism being somewhat distinct but yet influenced by European modernism is the artist Romaine Brooks. It's a really interesting discussion of gender as well, just like we talked about in the last chapter with Claude Cahun, and works that are perhaps more gender neutral or having a discussion about a blurring of lines between the traditional distinction of masculine versus feminine. Romaine Brooks is an American artist. She was born in New York City with a really interesting background. She had a lot of personal freedom because she was sort of disowned very young, very early age by her very wealthy parents in New York. And she was abandoned when she was only 7 years old and raised instead by a family that did the laundry for them. So she saw a more seedy underbelly of New York City than her general wealthy upbringing would have allowed. She later goes to Paris and she, hangs around with some artists there and met artists like Picasso. You can see an influence of James Whistler in her work, but also a really strong influence, art for art's sake, Whistler. But you can also see an influence of Manet in the work as well, because of the black blacks, not a lot of mixed color, kind of straight out of the tube, subdued colors, kind of like Manet's Olympia, for instance. She was an interesting artist. She lived in Paris, like I mentioned, and she kind of donned the personality of a male flaneur, but the female version of a male flaneur, which is interesting because Baudelaire had talked about how a flaneur was the consummate modern artist. Remember, like artists like Manet, Degas, Toulouse-Lautrec, documented or acted as flaneurs. And here, Baudelaire made a connection between the sexual male energy and someone that would watch others as sort of a voyeur. And it's ironic because here we see a female flaneur, also a flaneuse, which wasn't really a thing. It was more the male kind of energy. And so she's taking on that persona. Romaine Brooks was a lesbian. She was in a relationship with the American poet Natalie Clifford Barney, who she met while she was in Paris. So they were both kind of expatriates living in Paris. And her work is just really, really interesting. She did a lot of portraits. This is kind of influenced by Picasso a little bit, but different than what we see in European modernism. If you want to pause this and read this, I just wanted to show you an example of a poem by Natalie Clifford Barney. And Natalie would have salons similar to what we talked about with Gertrude Stein, and she had other writers like Proust that came and talked and had these events. And so this was a ripe conversation about art and literature and modernism. I love this portrait here. Another portrait of someone named Lady Trowbridge with her two dachshund weenie dogs, and an image that is also kind of this idea of shedding kind of the expectation of what it means to be feminine or what it means to be masculine. So she's doing a portrait of another individual and taking on male persona. So kind of these ideas of breaking gender social norms. This is the artist Robert Henri. Robert Henri was very influential. And kind of what's happening in American modernism, even Robert Henri had admitted that what he was doing was a little bit different than what's happening in Europe, okay? So some of the factors, first of all, America is remote. I mean, think about the ability to travel to Europe at that point was getting into a ship, right? Generally, only very wealthy people could afford to travel back and forth. So one of the factors that led to American modernism being very distinct from European modernism is just the distance. You know, in Europe, it's a lot easier to travel, and some of those exhibitions, whether it was the Impressionist exhibition or a Cubist exhibition, or later when we talked about Surrealism, those went from country to country in Europe. So it's very easy for someone in Belgium to see what's happening in Paris or Berlin or Amsterdam, right? Because travel in Europe was just a lot more easy to get around. So there was a sense of European modernism being all over the place in Europe, easy to see those ideas spread very, very quickly. They did not spread as easily or as quickly to the United States because of how remote New York and Philadelphia were and distinct. Another reason is, and Robert Henri admitted that he loved European modernism, and he kind of realized American contemporaries were a few steps behind. He said, our work is sort of considered immature compared to our European modernist counterparts, and they realized that in about 1913. So kind of comparing what they had done up to that point was still kind of grappling with Impressionism and Post-Impressionism. Another reason that American modernism is distinct and separate from European modernism between the wars, during World War I and before World War II, is also because U.S. collectors had a different taste. So Robert Henri and others were making work that they had hoped to sell, and they were making their work based on kind of what the appetite or the audience had dictate. Okay, so here you see Robert Henri, who becomes a really important teacher. He taught some really important artists at the beginning of the 20th century. He initiated what was called the Group of Eight. He didn't intend for it to be the Group of Eight. Originally, Robert Henri was joined by 4 Philadelphia artists, and 2 of the most famous of those are John Sloan and George Lukes. And then later, 3 other artists joined those 4 to create, nicknamed by a New York journalist, the Eight, as they exhibited together. So they were the landscape painters Ernest Lawson, Maurice Prendergast, and the symbolist Arthur Davies, which we'll talk about. He went to Europe and he interpreted symbolism from Europe, bringing back some of the ideas, right? So started as the Group of Eight, but their work wasn't necessarily unified. Robert Henri also started an independent art school and taught some of these artists like John Sloan and George Bellows. I love Robert Henri's work. It's very simplistic, it's colorful, it's usually a portrait of someone. And he wrote a great book, and if you have a chance to read it, I highly recommend it. It's called The Art Spirit, based on some of the lectures he gave as a teacher. Very inspirational. No matter what your style of art is, there's a lot of ideas there that are helpful for people in general. So John Sloan was part of the eight. He also was from Philadelphia and he moved to New York City, similar to Robert Henri. And their work in the Ashcan School was to highlight what was going on in kind of the seedy underbelly of New York City, right? Showing the social reality. So here we see an image by John Sloan that he thought was hilarious, this scene. And he used some kind of puns like Malcolm, like my comb, basically, of this hairdresser. He saw this and he went home and he immediately painted it from memory, right? And he talked about, what it was like, the hustle and the bustle in the city, the grittiness of New York. The eight becomes the Ashcan School, and the Ashcan School, nicknamed the Ashcan School, like trash can, like garbage can, like out of the ashes, is showing the social reality of how people are living in New York City, right? Another example of this is George Bellows. I love the work of George Bellows. He was also a student of Robert Henri. One second. Hey, Carly. Carly. Yeah. Timmy needs the face paint stuff. Okay, thanks. Peace. Sorry about the interruption. Getting ready for Pride, and I'm going to be out of town, so. George Bellows, I love his work. His work is gritty. It's sort of like a darkened version of post-impressionism. So meanwhile, while like Cubism is happening in Europe, the United States is isolated from that and instead depicting kind of post-impressionistic scenes of what it looks like in the Lower East Side of Manhattan, where a lot of newly immigrated citizens lived, poor social economic status. This is the masses, and it takes on themes of socialism, right? So this was called the cliff dwellers. These are these people in these low-income tenement houses that were so hot in the summer that people had to go out on their small balconies or go out into the street to escape the heat of inside. And they're really, really packed in tight. I mean, if you compare this to post-impressionist scenes like Renoir or Seurat's Sunday afternoon on the Grand Jatte, it isn't as pleasant, right? It isn't as peaceful. It's not about leisure. It's just about existing, eking out this existence. He also had beautiful paintings. I think some of the most interesting paintings happening at the turn of the century, whether it's Europe, America, or Mexico, or anywhere, is these portraits of people boxing. And the people that went to the boxing matches were lower class, middle class, sometimes rubbing elbows with the wealthiest, who were betting on these very, very poor boxers, these stag boxing matches, all about conflict. He pictures them like slabs of meat almost, getting punched and pummeled. But it's also about conflict. So the Ashcan School is showing us what the reality is and kind of how maybe if you're poor, think about the ideas of socialism, you're part of the working class, you're poor, you're always getting beat up on. Think about the quote by Marx that says that the bourgeoisie get richer off the backs of the proletariat. Well, here we see that in action. Some people are making money off literally the poorest of poor who are sacrificing their bodies, right, for the sake of riches, for the hope of riches for themselves and others. Also related to the Ashcan School is these social documentary photographers. And Jacob Riis is an example of this, and he is an artist that immigrated to the United States, a photographer that was interested in documenting the social reality. So he's a Danish immigrant. Carly can help you with that. It just needs to get reset. So a lot of immigrants moved to the Lower East Side in New York City, and they were living together in these 5 cents a room. Like they were actually illegally renting these rooms, advertised for 5 cents, and they were just packed in like sardines. This room is probably big enough for 2 people, not a dozen people. because they had just recently immigrated to the United States, coming from places in Europe, and just wanted to create a new life. And so this photographer, Jacob Riis, was a photographer for the newspaper and also for the police. He was a police reporter. He didn't work necessarily to shoot all of these photographs, though, as art, but they become seen as art. And this idea of documenting the reality, the social reality. And let's think about this, okay? So I want to read to you what is on the Statue of Liberty. Think about the new immigrants to the United States before even, and you know, 1886 is when the Statue of Liberty is put up. This photograph is from 1889, and he documents this reality to the turn of the century as well in the 19 teens. And this is what the Statue of Liberty says at the base, the poem penned by Emma Lazarus. It says, written in 1883, "Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses, yearning to breathe free, the wretched refuse of your teeming shore." So these were immigrants looking for a new life, for a new optimism, right? And the Statue of Liberty still says those words. Do they ring true today? Do we still have this welcoming port for immigrants? You know, there was no legal idea of immigration at the turn of the century, so most Europeans who came and immigrated to the United States did so illegally because there was no legal way of becoming a U.S. citizen, and they just came through Ellis Island. They were documented that way, and their names were written down. Oftentimes their names were changed. Oh, that's hard to pronounce. Here, we'll give you an American version of your name instead. And they said, hey, have good luck, right? And so a lot of them, a lot of newly immigrants were forced into a harsh reality. The Ashcan School wanted to show this, but also these social photographers that started with a particular purpose, but these works came to be seen as art. This is another photographer, Lewis Hine, very important photographer. He was a staff photographer for the National Child Labor Committee. And what he did was he visited factories to show the reality, and he was exposing child labor abuses, which actually, as a result of his photographs, laws were enacted because people didn't realize the conditions. And here is someone in a cotton mill, a young child who's helping to feed these spools of thread onto the cotton mill because an adult would have a tougher time. And adults, you know, could speak up for themselves in terms of unfair working abuses, but a child didn't always have that luxury. So Lewis Hine and others were able to enact positive change and create strict labor laws for all Americans, not just children, as a result of his photographs. And Jacob Riis as well had this same opportunity, right, to show people the gritty reality, the social reality. A third factor, I haven't mentioned the third factor, a third factor that leads to the separation of American modernism from European modernism is those artists in the United States are not experiencing the same things that they're experiencing in Europe. So the work is different. The work has a different subject matter and content. Think about it this way. World War I was mostly a war fought in Europe by Europeans. And then if you think about a lot of the artists that we talked about, German Expressionism, Der Blue Rider, they were literally impacted by World War I. Katie Kollwitz's son died in World War I. Some of these artists were wounded or physically or mentally wounded because they fought in the war. And Americans didn't have that same impact in their work. Historically, yes, Americans were impacted by World War I, but it wasn't literally on our shores. So if you think about the landscape that was ravaged in Europe in World War I and seeing much of a day-to-day focus of soldiers returning to life. And so a third factor is just American art had a different influence or a different subject matter or content. But one of the artists that was influential in bringing European modernism to America is this artist, Alfred Stieglitz. Alfred Stieglitz was a really central figure in American avant-garde. He later marries Georgia O'Keeffe. He started a gallery called 291 in New York that showed artists like Cezanne, Toulouse-Lautrec, Brancusi, right? Constantine Brancusi, the abstract sculptures. And then artists like Matisse and Braque. Later, Picasso. And so our American artists didn't see these works in person until Alfred Stieglitz brought them to the United States. Between 1908 and 1917, some of the best European modernists exhibited in this gallery 291. So that was a chance for American artists and American collectors to now be inspired by European modernism. He also started a magazine called Camera Work, talking about the potential of photography. And we're going to talk about two different types of photography that were popular at this time. One was a group called pictorialism. And pictorialism, or pictorialists, which Alfred Stieglitz started as, and so did Edward Steichen, who we'll talk about. Pictorialism was a way of making photography compete with and look like painting. So soft focus, some effects that they did to kind of create a sense of fine art out of what was seen as more of kind of a scientific. But Alfred Stieglitz preferred a different type of photography, what he called straight photography. That is to promote the idea, the benefits of what photography can do, to show reality. This is one of his best known photographs. It's in that medium of straight photography, i.e., no gimmicks, no making it look like a painting, not trying to do something in the dark room to change the focus or make it look more painterly. I'll show you an example. Of pictorialism, but straight photography more is just a straight up, here's what you see is what you get. And this is one of his most famous photographs, and you can see the sense of modernism in it. Has anyone seen the movie Titanic, right? And you can think about Rose being in the first class experience on the ship, and our friend Jack would have been in the steerage. He would be on the third class tickets. And what Alfred Stieglitz found was that the first class section of the ship, and so he's going on a ship back and forth from New York City to Paris, where he's bringing back artwork, right, for his gallery 291. He traveled a lot there for inspiration. Jack, though, if you think about the character from the Titanic, was having a better experience, right? There was parties, there was drinking going on, there was dancing going on in the third class steerage. The first class was a little more hoity-toity and classy. And remember, Rose said, "Draw me like your French girls, Jack," right? And Alfred Stieglitz remembered he was in the first class himself. He was wealthier, he had money. He was in the first class section, but he remembered going back to the steerage and say, "This is where the action is." And he was taken by the scene and the contrast between the top and the bottom here and this bridge. And he said it just felt very much like a design composition. He was struck by things like this round hat and the repetition in the chain on this bridge that led across, but also the contrast of the social reality, the first class versus the third class tickets. And the emphasis there is on a social reality, socialism, a sense of expression, yes, of ideas and content, but just getting it right, just being almost like a fly on the wall and saying, "I'm going to document this." And it's an important time in American modernism as well, because as they're defining it, and Alfred Stieglitz, in his Camera Work magazine, is starting to champion work like this, as opposed to work like this. His friend Edward Steichen, coming out of this pictorialist tradition to make things look like, this is a photograph, but it looks like a painting. He shot this sculpture of Rodin, Balzac, the philosopher and poet. He took a photograph of his statue for him, his sculpture, but he did it by moonlight at 4 a.m. to get this kind of softer, hazy focus. This is pictorialism, but eventually Edward Steichen moves away from that and favors the much more straight photography. So started in pictorialism here, moves into straight photography. I love this photograph. It's beautiful. Gloria Swanson. And he worked for Vogue and Vanity Fair, so a lot of his photographs were reproduced in that magazine as an example of beauty, fashion, but also straight photography. No gimmicks needed. I'm just going to take the photograph. So another idea about American modernism versus European modernism is it takes artists like Alfred Stieglitz, bringing European art over. And another big shift happens in 1913 with the Armory Show, which is the chance for a lot of American artists who have never been to Europe to see European modernism. We'll talk about that in a bit. You can remember the pieces like Matisse and Duchamp are shown in the Armory Show of 1913. But ironically, what it takes is artists like Max Weber, Marsden Hartley, this artist here, who are American painters, but then go live first in Paris and then in Berlin. He was inspired by artists like Kandinsky, Der Blureiter, and brings back this idea of what's happening in Paris, what's happening in Berlin, back to the United States, right? So there's not a direct conduit of schools in America teaching European modernism or enough of people being around seeing the work, right? A lot of times they saw it from really, really crappy black and white reproductions. Here's an example of cubism or symbolism almost in American modernism. And Marsden Hartley here isn't trying to be pro-German nationalist with his work, but it's a portrait of actually his lover. He was in a relationship with a German officer who was killed on the Western Front. And his name was Karl von Freyberg, which we can see his initials here, KVF. So this is a touching tribute to his gay lover. And it has a sense of signs and symbolism. And actually this is kind of prototypical for later what happens in the United States pop art. Because it's a lot of just popular culture things. In this case, a painting of a flag. So it's a two-dimensional painting of a lot of things that are already two-dimensional. The size and scale doesn't really make sense. It's basically he's interested in this kind of checkerboard pattern on flags and emblems that are signifiers of Germany and also being a German officer. One of the most interesting American modernist artists and kind of gets European modernism more than any other artist during this time period is Arthur Dove. Arthur Dove is one of the first artists to do abstraction. He saw Kandinsky's works. He was an American that went and studied in Europe. He moved to Paris. He had a successful career in the United States as an illustrator, which a lot of artists in America were trained as illustrators. Even the Ashcan School, like John Sloan and George Bellows, like this, they were trained as illustrators and then kind of bring that interest to art. Arthur Dove was a successful illustrator, abandoned that commercial kind of output, and then went to Europe, moved to Paris, and observed modernism there and saw some of Kandinsky's early abstractions, was inspired by them. What's cool about this too is it's a different medium than we've talked about a lot. A lot of times with abstraction, it's paint, it's oil paint, or maybe it's collage like with the Dada artists. But here it's pastel, something that we usually associate with much more realistic work or representational work. And here he's using pastel, beautifully drawn on paper. And it's meant to be nature symbolized, but nature in a much looser, expressive, energetic, abstract way. So it doesn't have to look like a particular tree or a flower. It's just really, really abstracting it. And so Americans started to become aware of European art by being immersed in it, right? And so we still consider this American modernism, but it's really an American in Europe. Alfred Stieglitz, we mentioned before, had that very important gallery, 291. And 291, the last exhibition, was the first exhibition by his wife, Georgia O'Keeffe, who becomes really synonymous with American modernism. Her work is really, really interesting. This is a photograph that Alfred Stieglitz took of Georgia O'Keeffe's hands. And we know this is her as a model because he literally titled it O'Keeffe Hands. She becomes really famous in the United States as an artist and kind of a celebrity. Her work is much misaligned, though, or misinterpreted. A piece like this has been explained throughout our history. Even at the time, a male critic said, I see what's happening here. This is about femininity. This is about female genitalia. Georgia O'Keeffe corrected him and said, look at the title. It's called Music, Pink and Blue. And a lot of her work was close-ups, very, very beautiful close-ups of flowers. And people see her paintings all the time and say, oh, I get it. She was all about female genitalia, and these look like vaginas. But that's essentially mansplaining. That has been a male patriarchal interpretation of her work as a way to kind of explain it away and say, she's female, of course her work's feminine. She never meant for her work to be that way. And she actually corrected people when they would say that that was it about. It was about this implicit female sexuality and about sexual expression. She said, no, that's bullshit. It's not. So it's a misinterpretation of her work. But this persists to this day. And sometimes even people will say she had this female sexual liberation message in her work as propaganda. No, she didn't. She split her time between New York City. Her early work was very modern and showed the city life, a lot of skyscrapers, etc. But she escapes New York, moves to the West in New Mexico, and leaves the idea of what people kept mislabeling as feminist or female, feminine work, and started to do a lot of desert scenes, landscapes, cow skulls that she said, people aren't going to misinterpret this as being feminine, right? It's more about the experience. Male subjects were rarely, misinterpreted, right? If someone looked at Manet's Olympia, it could be voyeuristic. It could be about, female objectification, and people would give the artist the benefit of the doubt, right? In the early 20th century, critics and art historians would always draw a harsh line and say, here's what Georgia O'Keeffe's doing. She's a female artist. We're separating her out from her male counterparts. And Georgia O'Keeffe, in more of a feminist manner, is saying, no, treat me like a male artist. Pretend that a man painted this. Would you talk the same way about this being about female genitalia? If this was painted by a man, you probably would not. You would say, like Kandinsky, naming his piece's composition, you would say, oh, it's brilliant. Look at the sounds, look at the colors, the sense of harmony, music, just like in art. And here, this is called Music, Pink and Blue, and people are going to read something else into it. More about straight photography. Here's an example of straight photography, Paul Strand. He had studied in New York City with Louis Hine. Remember that straight photographer who had helped, raise awareness of child labor. He also was friends with Alfred Stieglitz. His works were shown in 291, the gallery, but also reproduced in camera work. And it kind of shows a sense of beauty and straight photography. Imogene Cunningham, similarly, her work, like Georgia O'Keeffe, was a sense of looking at nature close up. It didn't matter if it was a mountain, a pepper, or a flower, but look at the beauty, look at the gracefulness of this. Straight photography. So her work was similar to Paul Strand's straight photography, friends with Alfred Stieglitz, and we see a sense of, kind of also what we see in Edward Weston and Ansel Adams, like this beautiful piece by Ansel Adams. And Ansel Adams was raising awareness about the environment. He was a member of the Sierra Club, and he had championed environmental concerns way before a lot of people were thinking about environmental concerns and making parks national parks and that they should stay national parks. And he was the official photographer for the Sierra Club. Sierra Club still exists to this day. trying to raise awareness for issues about land preservation and keeping the environment safe of pollution and industrialization, because during the Industrial Revolution, they saw huge swaths of American land just decimated because of overpopulation, mining, factories. And here's something that America has that Europe doesn't have. So modernism can show the beauty of this untapped natural habitat. And Ansel Adams is just famous for his technique, his craftsmanship, his perfectionism. And he would say that he would take 100 photographs to hopefully get one good one. This piece here, though, is not in the book, and I wanted to show you this. This is very, I would say, emblematic of Ansel Adams' works, and the contrast between black and white. Great sense of tonality and scale. We can imagine ourselves in this landscape. We can imagine the effects that we as humans have. And that's called the Anthropocene. I don't know if you've ever heard of that word before. Anthropocene means the element of human interaction with nature, the ability that humans have in changing the landscape, good or bad, right? And so this is observing nature unspoiled by human touch. 1913 is a total shift. It's a huge game changer. We talked about the Armory show before. This is a photograph of that actual exhibition, and for the first time, American audiences are seeing European modernism, works like this by Duchamp. So there's this heavy line drawn in the sand from kind of pre-1913, just little bits and pieces of European modernism coming over to the United States, and just seeing reproductions of them, hearing about them. So someone maybe like Marsden Hartley goes over there, or Arthur Dove goes over to Europe and comes back and says, dude, you got to see all this work that's in Europe. It's crazy, and describes it to his friends or maybe collectors here. But then the Armory show really whets the appetite of American audiences for modernism, for European modernism. And an example of a major manifestation of European modernism, but making itself manifested differently in the United States, is the works of the Precisionists, which in the 1920s, their work is so different, because remember, they're not directly impacted by World War I. So post-World War I and before World War II, different subject matter. And instead of it's kind of like an American version of Cubism, but instead of showing kind of the gritty reality of Europe, it's showing the beauty and the pride in the industrialization of modern cities in the United States, as sort of seeing these as the new Gothic churches, skyscrapers, factories. Charles Sheeler was trained as a professional photographer, and what he would do is take photographs of these skyscrapers and these factories. He was born in Philadelphia. So many of these artists born and trained in Philadelphia and then moved to New York City. And his friend Charles Demuth, another precisionist artist, it's not really a particular style. It's basically looking at modernity and how that influences art. Actually, George O'Keeffe had kind of started in this way of working visually, but then shifts more into the studies of the flowers and then later the desert landscape in New Mexico. I love the work of the Precisionists. They actually called themselves the Immaculates. They were trying to show the immaculateness of the city, kind of stripped of people, devoid of people, but just kind of look at how this painting glows, right? It's showing this as kind of like a new church. The hustle and the bustle of the city, factories, the power of steam engines, modernity, the good aspects of modernity. I love this piece. It's called The Figure 5 in Gold, and it's based on a poem by William Carlos Williams. That poem is on page 354 if you want to read it along with me. And the poem called The Great Figure says, among the rain and lights, I saw the figure 5 in gold on a red fire truck, moving tense, unheeded to gong clangs, siren howls, and wheels rumbling through the dark city. Great symbolic poem, and Charles Demuth captures the spirit of the William Carlos poem of this. You can kind of get the sense of this fire truck moving closer to you, right? And the lights and the sirens and the sounds going off. So at first this seems abstract, but then when you see the imagery mentioned in the poem, like the dark city, you can see these skyscrapers in the background. And notice he puts William Carlos Williams' name in it. Bill Carlos. And down here, the initials William Carlos Williams, and Charles Demuth's initials here, CD. The art company listed over here. It's a painting as a celebration of the modern city. Another interpretation of the city in a blossoming, burgeoning culture, black culture during the Harlem Renaissance. Such an interesting, pivotal moment in American history. So many black Americans had moved from the South, the Great Migration, to the North, and there was an amazing emergence of black culture in Harlem. Some writers like Langston Hughes, Zora Neale Hurston, James Baldwin, amongst others, and singers like Bessie Smith, Louis Armstrong, Duke Ellington, that are associated with Harlem in New York, and black culture, a unique black culture and black art and music and photography and writing that's happening that's inspirational to the rest of the world. And one of these painters is Palmer Hayden, who, interestingly enough, documents another painter, Cloyd Boykin, who was a friend of his, who was known as a janitor. So this painting is called A Janitor Who Paints. And he said of the work, I painted him because no one called Cloyd a painter. They called him a janitor. And here he shows him painting in his house. Beautiful painting, touching subject in the tradition of Henry Ossawa Tanner, but also showing the social reality. And here he's making a connection between the garbage can and Cloyd's role as a janitor, but also the composition, the palette, the round palette here, and the round clock and his round hat mimic the shape of the round trash can lid. Beautiful work, some really interesting work coming out of the Harlem Renaissance as a result of the Great Migration, and some of the words of W.E.B. Du Bois and others like Marcus Garvey. This is a black photographer, part of the Harlem Renaissance, documenting the Great Migration and the culture and the beauty and the sights and the sounds of what you would experience in Harlem is the very famous and contributed greatly to the advance of photography, straight photography, James Van Der Zee. And he documented the upper class, the burgeoning middle class and upper class in Harlem during the Harlem Renaissance. It's a visual portrait of Harlem at the time. Events like funerals, weddings, graduations. He was great at documenting what was going on. This is an interesting photograph that I show. It's Marcus Garvey on the far right here, who was, in terms of the advancement of black ideals. Marcus Garvey is a really interesting revolutionary. He actually had encouraged people, African Americans at the time, to move back to Africa, to kind of regain their roots, study their heritage. And here he's shown with Prince Kojo, who was from a wealthy family, a royal family in Benin, who spoke against French colonialism that usurped the royalty of the actual lineage, the indigenous people in Benin. So a really, really interesting photograph and document. Marcus Garvey, if you ever study Marcus Garvey, very influential. Marcus Garvey influenced later black leaders like Martin Luther King and Malcolm X. But Marcus Garvey had some really interesting beliefs. And actually, he championed the Ku Klux Klan, which seemed very much like odd bedfellows. But he was saying, actually, at the time, so much different than the Ku Klux Klan, as it evolved historically and recently, and in terms of white supremacy. He at the time was saying we're advocating for the rights of whites just like we're advocating for the rights of blacks. It's equality. It's not a zero-sum game where we're taking away from someone else. So he has a kind of a controversial viewpoint in that a lot of people disown some of his later talks, but he actually settled in Africa and started this idea of returning to Africa, people understanding the heritage of where they came from. A really interesting brief time period, there was a movement called regionalism. And regionalism was much more interested. Thomas Hart Benton studied, he was from Missouri, he moved to New York, but he also had spent some time in Paris. He did his version of post-impressionism, he did his version of cubism, but then he said later he rejected modernism. He said it took him 10 years to get that modernism dirt out of my system, and he wanted to reflect a work that was more emblematic of Gothic art, Renaissance art, neoclassical art. So American modernism that celebrated the worker, that celebrated shipbuilding that we can see here, the cities, steam, but showing kind of an older style of art. He rejected American modernism, as did Grant Wood. Grant Wood never made art that was similar to the European modernism, but he was aware of it, and he ran in some of the same circles. And he said that every region, every locality in the United States has its own culture. Let's show that culture as opposed to trying to keep up with what's happening in New York or in Paris or in Europe, right? So that's why we get the name of regionalism, and it's really against modernism. They did not favor American modernism or European modernism. They didn't like abstraction. They didn't like cubism. And here we can see he was really inspired when he went first to Paris and then to Germany. Instead of looking at what was happening in European modernism, he spent time in those museums and looked at work like Gothic art. He looked at the early Flemish and German Northern Renaissance painters like Van Eyck and Dürer and was inspired by their sense of realism, which he tried to emulate here. And this is called American Gothic, his most famous piece. It's in the Art Institute of Chicago, and you can see this there. It's called American Gothic because of the Gothic window in the church, and it's sort of a new church. It's the American farmer, the grittiness, the resilience of the American farmer. The reality of this, though, is very much posed. This is actually his sister and his dentist, and they're not a couple, and neither one of them are farmers. So he's trying to show what it was like growing up in Iowa, where he's from, but it's a fiction, which is interesting because he was all about American realism. So it's kind of like an idea of let's go back to the way things were as opposed to American modernism, which is really interesting. So we call that regionalism. And Edward Hopper is an artist in New York who's lumped in oftentimes with the regionalists. Critics called his work regionalism because he was looking at, just like Grant Wood said, every place has its culture, every place has its unique, music and food and all those things, and you want to celebrate those regional qualities. Edward Hopper did the same thing, but he hated the term regionalism. He said it was a caricature of Americanism and what American culture was like. He thought this was too cheesy, too much of an exaggeration, or trying to make things look hokey, or kind of like today we might say it's like the Hallmark version of what the reality really was like. Maybe that's painting it with too broad of a brush, but he did not like the label regionalism. Edward Hopper obviously is famous for this painting that shows the reality of the Depression in 1942. This sort of also looks like the pandemic too. Empty streets, just a few isolated people in a cafe. This says Carolina Morning. That's incorrect. I don't know why This is up. This is showing depression. This is actually the Nighthawk Cafe, and it shows the reality of the depression and its impact on Americans. So ignore the title there. I had switched it and I forgot to change the title. Another painter from the Harlem Renaissance is Romare Bearden, who intentionally painted in a way that was more folk-ish, like an outsider artist or a self-taught artist, to show the reality of what's going on in Harlem. He was originally from New York and was part of the Great Migration, and so Romare Bearden's reflects that. I love this piece. This is an album cover by The Roots. Romare Bearden oftentimes incorporated collage, similar to Picasso, but showed the gritty reality of the city streets and also what it was like to be in Harlem, the kind of the sights and the sounds. And Jacob Lawrence is also another artist from the Harlem Renaissance. He did a great series of murals that were shown as a way of showing the travel that took place because of the Great Migration. And he did a lot of research about what it was like for the African American experience, as that, which was basically his subject matter here. He made 60 panels on the theme of the migration by black men and women from the rural South to more the industrial North during and after World War I, the Great Migration. And he symbolizes it, he streamlines it, he simplifies it so that people could see themselves in the work. It's a portrait of every man and not a particular man, which is really interesting. Very influential artist in terms of black artists in the United States, and also very emblematic of what was going on in the Harlem Renaissance. This is an example of social realism, and Ben Shahn was a Jewish artist against fascism. And this is the very famous trial of Sacco and Vanzetti, the two Italian anarchists, two Italian immigrants who were tried of a crime that people didn't really think they did. People think that they were convicted more because they were anarchists as opposed to that they actually committed this crime of murdering someone during a robbery. And people protested and rallied to their defense. This was actually a poster that Ben Shahn had made for basically coming to their support, and it shows them almost like Christian martyrs, Sacco and Vanzetti here. It was a rallying call. People stood, tried to stand up for them, stand up for their rights, and ultimately they were still killed, put to death. And it kind of shows a sense of American democracy and how people believed that it was more because of their political alignment versus what they actually did. This is a photographer, a very famous photographer, Dorothea Lange, who photographed actually through Arkansas as well, but photographed the result of the Dust Bowl, the Great Depression. Dorothea Lange and others worked for the Farm Security Agency, which was a part of the Works Progress Administration, to show the social reality of what was going on. And this was very influential because you had a lot of people on the coast or a major city who didn't see the rural reality of the rural poor. This becomes, in a way, a chance for people, just like those early tenement photographs by Jacob Riis and Louis Hine that enacted change. Dorothea Lange was able to show Americans, and this was eventually in Life magazine, what it was like and how these people were suffering. Now, in New York City and LA, they had obviously soup lines and soup kitchens where people could line up and there was people on unemployment, but they didn't know how hard hit most Americans were in the Midwest or in flyover country, right? And she documented Mississippi, Missouri, Arkansas, Kansas, and showed these migrant workers, and this is called Migrant Mother. She had been photographing all day, and most of the photographs, remember we talk about self-fashioning all the time. You know, think about how Romaine Brooks, at the beginning of this chapter, self-fashions herself as a flaneur and poses for that painting, paints herself in a way that's very dramatic. when we pose for a photograph, we kind of choose, if we're the subject matter, how we're going to stand, if we're going to smile, not smile. And this woman, for most of the photographs, she's been nicknamed the Madonna of the Depression. This, in a way, Dorothea Lange is one of the first documentary photographers or photojournalists. And all day, this migrant mother was smiling. She was pretending to be happy. And at the end of the day, when she just sat down and she was breastfeeding her child, her two kids who were hungry, who hadn't eaten in days, are just tired and rest for a moment on her. And Dorothea Lange takes this very candid photograph, kind of showing the reality as opposed to her smiling. And this woman is like in her early 30s, and she looks like she's 50, just because she's lived a really, really difficult existence. This was helped to pass legislation and give those people on the coast an idea of what help was needed. So help was on the way because of photographs by Dorothea Lange and Walker Evans, who also worked for the Foreign Security Agency. Thinking about photojournalism and documentary photography, this is an artist, Margaret Bourke-White, who takes photographs. She took some of the first photographs of like Auschwitz and other places being liberated in World War II. But she was one of the first photographers for Life magazine, and showing kind of the reality, the social reality here in the United States and also in Europe. So this starts this idea of basically like straight photography, photojournalism, showing things the way that they really are, but also beautiful, iconic, abstract. You can see the way that these towers are shown. Very, very beautiful, showing the emphasis here. This is a very famous photograph that appeared in Life magazine. Some people theorize that it was actually posed, but this becomes a very iconic image of the conclusion of World War II and soldiers returning, and during this parade, this kind of moment where this random woman runs up and gives this sailor who's returning this kiss. And you can see a sense of the pictorial journalism just capturing the moment. It didn't matter what you were photographing. If you gave a sense of objectivity, the subject matter would speak to an audience. So a photographer was sort of there as a neutral, unbiased observer, right? Really interesting in the development of the ideas of photojournalism. Also in terms of American modernism, Mexican muralists that have been nicknamed the Grand Three, the three great artists, who are Diego Rivera, Jose Clemente Orozco, and also David Alfaro Siqueiros, who will look at their work. Very, very beautiful. Mexico was an interesting place in terms of a social revolution was happening as well. Diego Rivera was a very important artist. He worked to highlight what was happening in Mexico. He was friends with Picasso. He went and saw Paris. He studied there after completing his education in Mexico City. He went to Paris. He saw the work happening there. He went to Rome. He was much more impressed by the works of Michelangelo than he was by European modernism. And he said he wanted to renew that great tradition of fresco mural paintings. And really today we have Diego Rivera to thank for how many murals exist in the United States. He reinvigorated the practice. Up until the 1920s, 1930s, there's not really a lot of murals happening in the United States. Diego Rivera sees the Sistine Chapel by Michelangelo and says, I want to bring that back to Mexico as a celebration of what's happening in his native land of Mexico. But Americans quickly seize those ideas and say, come show how amazing capitalism is. And Diego Rivera thinks this is hilarious because he's a socialist. He actually, him and his wife Frida Kahlo, put up the communist Trotsky. They put him up after Stalin had taken power and wanted to murder Trotsky. They put him up. They were sympathetic to early communist ideas and more in line with socialism. But here Diego Rivera goes to Detroit, my hometown, and I love this piece. I feel like this is near and dear to my heart. This is now in the Detroit Institute of Arts, but this was the boardroom for Henry Ford. Now it's a museum, and Henry Ford invited him to come show the beauties of capitalism. But instead, what Diego Rivera does is slips in socialism and communism, and it's about the worker. He shows this beast of a machine, and it's like these workers are fighting the machine. And who has the power? The worker. It shows these scientists making gases, poisons that would be used in war. They're evil. It shows, the idea of medicine, how medicine should be there for everyone, not just the wealthy. And he also showed people from all the different continents. This is very pro-worker, but Henry Ford and others thought it was this huge, statement about capitalism, which is just ironic. And actually, Rockefeller invited Diego Rivera to do a mural there in the Rockefeller Center, and he put a portrait of Lenin in it, and it pissed off Rockefeller because obviously you don't put a portrait of Lenin in something that's supposed to be about democracy and capitalism. So he told Diego Rivera to change it, remove the portrait of Lenin. He said, "I will not." He gave him back the money and said, "Have someone else paint this." And they did just that. They actually painted over the mural that Diego Rivera had made. He later recreates it in Mexico so you can see what it looks like, but very pro-Mexican. So these are part of the Los Tres Grandes, meaning the great three Mexican mural artists. Jose Orozco is another one, and he was similar to Diego Rivera, interested in social protest, the worker or laborer as having a political power. So this piece is called The Epic of American Civilization, Modern Migration of the Spirit. And he worked in LA, so he received his training in the United States, but he also did murals throughout the United States, including in LA and California. This is in Dartmouth College in New Hampshire. Dartmouth College is a very progressive liberal institution, but it's, look at this, the guns and the war here knocking over culture and other civilizations. This is not a very pro-American mural, even though it says the epic of American civilization. Think about ideas like Manifest Destiny and kicking out indigenous peoples to take over land, right? And the idea of capitalism spreading throughout and democracy spreading throughout the world. Orozco makes that a negative commentary on that, but the pro-labor movement here. So it's kind of seeing like someone as an atypical hero. The last of these three great Mexican mural artists is the work by Siqueiros. And Siqueiros was trained also in Mexico City. He was part of a union there. He was pro-union, pro-laborer, and he was a radical political advocate. And he lived in LA and taught in LA, where he executed murals and really helped to, in LA today, there are so many murals, and it is based on this tradition of Siqueiros and others. And actually, in the 90s, for a while, murals were banned because people saw them as too political and having some kind of agenda. And so they banned murals and graffiti for about 10-year period. It was illegal to do murals in LA, and then in the early 2000s, they lifted that ban. But it comes from this pro-socialist, communist, Mexican tradition. So this powerful three group of artists, and he had just actually become part of the anti-fascist Republican Army during the Spanish Civil War in 1937. Think about that year, 1937, right? Picasso's Guernica, Salvador Dali's painting that we looked at that was also about the Spanish Civil War. And this piece as well, a Mexican artist living in the United States doing a piece inspired by the Spanish Civil War, 1937. And this is the scream as the result, the reality of war. This young kid has kind of like repeated, his face zoomed in, and you can see how the landscape is decimated. War is bad. Anti-fascist here. You see this guy is becoming like a martyr, like Christ on the cross. but here he's chopped it down, trying to start a new religion, a new idea. Diego Rivera was married to Frida Kahlo. Frida Kahlo had a very tough upbringing. She had, in 1925, suffered a bus accident where her spine and pelvis collapsed, and she spent most of her life in a brace. It was really difficult and painful for her to paint. A lot of times she was just stricken to her bed and had to paint in bed. But amazing artist, really, really interesting. And if you think about her work, similarly to Georgia O'Keeffe, was a lot of times misaligned. The surrealist artist Andre Breton adopted Frida Kahlo and said, she's a surrealist. She's going to show with the surrealist. And when Diego Rivera was in New York, she came along and she was painting, and people said, you're a great painter. Why don't you paint a mural? You should paint murals. And she said, I am painting my murals, but they're about me and they're on canvases. I don't need to do them on the wall. They're much more personal. And people said, it's great that you're a surrealist artist. Your work is about dreams, right? These dream landscapes and the subconscious and Freud, like the other surrealists. And she said, I'm not a surrealist. My work is not about dreams. My work is about my reality, how I actually live. So a lot of times in critics and historians and even her fellow artist friends would say she's a surrealist, she would have to correct them. Her work is beautiful. It's amazing. She does something very, very unique. She uses her own face and likeness as a metaphor for the Mexican tradition. And a lot of times the sense of the exotic, right? And a lot of her work is kind of a torn between the traditions in Mexico to the new kind of modernization and kind of one foot in American culture as well. Really, really interesting work and very, very beautiful. She made a lot of self-portraits that explored her grief, her pain, her tragedy in her life. There's a really great movie called Frida. Selma Hayek plays Frida Kahlo in that and shows the very caustic and toxic relationship that she had with Diego Rivera. In a way, she was championing his work for the sake of her own, to spite her own work, kind of took a back seat to what he did. But now we really celebrate and recognize the genius of Frida Kahlo as a true, unique, singular artist, because she was doing things that no one else was doing at the time. It's very, very unusual just to focus mostly on her entire career on self-portraits, beautiful self-portraits, really, really interesting. So her work was autobiographical. The last couple artists that we're going to talk about is how abstraction manifests itself in American modernism, how they were not necessarily directly influenced by these European modernists, but kind of twisted it and converted it to make it their own. Beautiful work by Stuart Davis. He was a modern artist, deeply committed to socialist reforms, just like some of those other artists, but unlike the Mexican muralists and Ben Shahn, his work was kind of devoid of political content, right? His work was all about American culture, but abstracted, almost like Cubism. And I really see it as proto-pop art. This is essentially pop art, because look at all the signs, the posters, the ads, the shapes. It looks a lot, and the colorfuls, the bright colorfuls. He studied with Robert Henri, so he had a sense of kind of mimicking observational art, but he did it with his own lens and this kind of abstract language. Similar to Alexander Calder, who's very famous for his mobiles, this kinetic art and mobility that he showed in the work so that it could move. Very, very interesting. His teacher was John Sloan, who was also an important artist during the Ashcan movement. And you can see the emphasis on play and whimsy and interest in, I love this, a portrait of Romulus and Remus, the mythical twins who founded Rome, and suckling on the teat of the she-wolf. They were abandoned and raised by this she-wolf, and here they are. And this is kind of a funny, whimsical interpretation. If you've been in Maggie's 3D design, 3D studio class, she has students work with wire and try to make something that's two-dimensional into 3 dimensions. He did that quite a bit. Very, very playful. A really great sense of balance as well to make a mobile that balances one element with a lot of. He was really great with that ability. So his work is really innovative and interesting, and it's all about kind of kinetic and play. Very, very innovative, really interesting. And that is it. So peace out. Next chapter is abstract expressionism, one of my favorites. So we'll talk about that next time. See y'all. Peace.